on the presentation later. So great to be here with you. Thank you for giving your time to engage with the question of donut economics and business. I'm going to go through a bit of an introduction to donut economics, as well as an introduction to myself, so you know who you're hearing from, before moving on to this emerging area of what does this international framework, global framework that represents our relationship with our planet, humans' relationship with the planet. What does it mean for business? It's an emerging area because we have kept it closed as a Doughnut Economics Action Lab, but hopefully you'll see the direction we're going. I'd love to hear questions, challenges, any kind of insights that you can provide, because this is about other people who can help us co-create these ideas and visions as we move forward. So wonderful to see familiar faces and names from across the world, and thank you for joining. So firstly, a little bit about me and my story. I started off in the business world at Procter & Gamble many years ago, before moving into working in aid and development, but through a perspective of markets and farmers and ways to connect rural economies in a way that helps alleviate poverty, to then moving into Oxfam. I was there for 7 years running campaigns and trying to make mostly big companies behave in a way that is going to be as inclusive as possible. I'm just going to mute everyone if that's all right, by the way. Okay, so and then after that, I ended up moving into the World Fair Trade Organization, where I was the chief executive for a number of years, and helping that community of social enterprises who practice fair trade in different ways. Then moving into this new role, which is locationally Earth, thinking about our ecology and our social challenges together in a combined way, and figuring out what this means for the business world. Well, first, let's think about how the 21st century has begun, because donut economics is very much a reaction and a response to the crises that have dominated our economies. It's a reaction to the financial meltdown that was at the beginning earlier in our century. It feels so much longer ago. We've had so many crises since, but if you remember the financial meltdown, it very much pointed us in the direction of needing to recreate and redesign our economies more broadly. And then we've had a series of climate breakdowns. We've seen the effects of the climate crisis upon so much of the world. And we're now in the midst of what seems to be COVID lockdowns and crises connected to the health crisis around COVID. And all of this is saying that there's something broken in our relationship with our ecology, with our living planet. There is something that needs to be reinvented in our societies, our economies, and it feels like it's something that so many of us recognize around the world and feel like we need to lift our game to transform things. So what does donut economics say about all this? Well, it's a compass for human prosperity. It's a way of rethinking about the way our economy functions and the way we relate to our living planet. It puts at the outer limit an ecological ceiling that says, look, we have planetary boundaries here. And this comes from the amazing work of Professor Rockstrom and others from the Stockholm Resilience Center, who have laid out the limits of our planet, the boundaries of our planet. And this is a reality that defines the way we need to behave in the economy as people who think about the business world. Well, on the other side, we also have the social foundation. We've got that inner circle, that floor that we cannot fall below. So this is the floor that means that everybody has access to life's essentials, whether it's food, water, income, housing, energy, all those things that we need our economy to be providing us as societies around the world. Well, we can't shrink our economic activity to a point where we don't provide those things anymore. So it's in between these two boundaries, the planetary boundary that we cannot overshoot, and the social foundation, which we cannot fall short of, that we need to exist, and we need to build economies, businesses, financial systems, and societies within this safe and just space for humanity. Now, this idea has been embraced by some very, new voices from very different perspectives. Lots of different organizations and leaders have taken to it. And here's a bit of a snapshot of the fact that this putting the social and the ecological together in a single framework, in circles, in concentric circles, that have in so many cultures been a way of demonstrating balance and harmony has taken the world a little bit by storm in places from Bhutan to Chile to across Europe and to the Vatican and the Pope's economic vision to various publications. There's something powerful in this diagram that sort of set ripples around the world in different ways, and it also forced us to look at ourselves and think, well, how are we doing on this donut? This picture is economic vision. What does it look like? And for the first time ever in history, we can look at ourselves through that perspective and think, this is our collective selfie. This is how we are doing as human beings on a living planet that depend on a living planet. We are in overshoot on most things that we can measure. In fact, it was just yesterday that new research showed that on chemical pollution as well, we are in huge overshoot. It was for the first time quantified in the language of planetary boundaries. And while being in huge overshoot, we're also under-delivering on life's essentials. We're in shortfall on the social foundation. It's a picture, it's a story of failure. It's a picture and it's a story of something being inherently broken. However, the economy that has created this picture, the footprints of the companies, the government policies, the institutions that have formulated actions that have led to this, well, they never saw this photo when they were created. They were from another period. They were from the 20th century. Now in the 21st century, we are the first generation to see that global selfie and think, my God, we can do this differently. We can recreate ourselves to live within our planetary boundaries and deliver life's essentials for everybody on this planet. Well, the picture, that's a global picture. There are a bunch of national pictures as well, everywhere from around the world, and that's all been published. And what we see is a narrative and a story that's quite clear. The world's richer countries tend to do better in delivering life's essentials, but they are in huge overshoot of planetary boundaries. The world's countries with lower incomes are using much fewer of the world's resources, but are also in hugely under-delivering on life's essentials for their populations. What this tells us is that A, we can't have the developing world build their economies in the same way that leads to the overshoot of the US or UK, or for that matter, the Netherlands or Sweden or any of them. The story is the same. There is no golden example. Nobody is within the donut. And the economic journey that took us here cannot take us to the next destination. It also tells us that actually, in order to increase and improve social conditions across the world, we've relied on overstretching our planetary boundaries, and we've relied on a system of overuse that is also not sustainable and cannot be the solution that takes the rest of the world with us. So that's the current picture. That's the landscape that we're working in. But what does all this mean for business? This huge macro perspective, this global level and national level selfies that we have of how we are doing as a species. Well, it means that we probably need to think about transforming business. It means that we need to recognize that many of the decisions that have led to the carbon footprints, that have led to the low incomes and hunger, that have led to growing inequality, that have led to the overuse of land resources and other resources, well, those decisions are made predominantly by businesses, by companies, in the way they produce, in the way that they trade, in the way that they share the value and benefits and fruits of their economic activity. So a transformation is in the offing, and we need to understand what that transformation could look like. But first, let's have a look at the current business world. What does the current business world do on the corporate to-do list? Well, the corporate to-do list starts right at the bottom with a do-nothing approach, which is incredibly prominent. There are a lot of companies that wait for somebody else to fix this problem. I might be in an industry or in a sector where there's huge amounts of social or ecological problems, but hey, it's not my job. My business is to do business. The next level is to do what pays now, to think about, well, actually, maybe I can reduce my carbon emissions or water usage because that will reduce my bills. Maybe I can actually improve pay or conditions for workers because I will be rewarded handsomely and immediately by the market. And doing what pays now is also very prevalent currently. That's fine, but it's not the full set of solutions we need. Then there's the next level of doing your fair share. So companies that try to think about, well, what would be my fair share of resources? What would be my fair share of negative social impacts? You know, if there is such a thing that could be fair. Well, if you've ever been to a restaurant with a big group of friends and eventually a bill has come and everyone said, right, figure out what your fair share is and throw it onto the table, you don't want to be the person holding the bill at the end of that dinner, because rarely is what people think their fair share is what their actual fair share is. And the same is true when we look at companies who claim to be doing their fair share. There isn't an agreed methodology, there isn't an agreed way of working it out, and we're falling short of fair share around the planet. So the next level is to get to mission zero. So this is where a lot of the net zero emissions targets are coming in, commitments to zero slave labor, all these things which are great. But as a great philosopher once said, why aim to be 100% less bad when we can actually aim to do good? And that good is what we are calling doing the donut. So that's our snapshot of how we think the business world is currently structured and their levels of ambition currently. But the business world is also operating within a production system and a broader economic infrastructure that has a take, make, use, lose culture throughout. And these practices are prevalent. We take from Mother Nature, we make things, we use them, and then we lose them. And this is repeated over and over and over again. And I think all of us are beginning to realize that this model of take, make, use, lose being repeated is not justifiable and cannot go on for much longer. So there's something fundamental that needs to change in the way we produce and consume products. Now, there is an alternative that's brewing and it's coming from a concept called circular economy that I'm sure many of you realize is among us already. It means that we need to think about the biological nutrients and the technical nutrients separately from each other, and thinking about ways that we could convert these into circular models that are on the biological side, helping us regenerate and capture value at each stage of decomposition, and on the technical side, helping us to restore, repair, reuse, refurbish, recycle those nutrients so that we have much longer cycles that hopefully end up closing the loop longer term. So these are models of production that are possible. But let's put the theory aside for a second. Let's look at practice, because it is happening in practice. These practices are happening at Sanji toilets, for instance, in Kenya, near Nairobi, in the slums, where new toilets are installed, and the waste from those toilets ends up turning into manure that is used in production of food. Now, we've also got the example of Fairphone, a modular product design that has taken the world by storm. It's done quite well of late. It's got a very interesting financing model behind it and a real strong commitment both on the social side, but interestingly, making these modular phones, which are incredibly unique, because the standard in the industry is to have built-in obsolescence, to throw products out, because you can sell more products that way, you make more income that way. But alternatives have evolved, and Fairphone has demonstrated it's possible. Well, Houdini is another interesting example. In the way that they've designed their products allows the technical and the biological nutrients to be separated easily. The biological nutrients go into agricultural systems, which creates food. And then we've got the interesting example of Interface, which is got a production model that is trying to aim to be a factory becoming a forest, which means that it is giving out more nutrients than it's taking in. Its model of carpet production is also incredibly different, because it rents carpets out in terms of blocks, which can be returned and refurbished, and there is little to zero waste that comes out of that entire system. So there are these interesting examples going on of production models that are starting to turn their back on the take, make, use, lose production, but it's still happening in nowhere near a sufficient amount across the board. Now, we've got the social side of the equation, and that's one of the powers of Doughnut Economics, is that it forces you to look at both. You can't just be regenerative, you have to try to be an alternative to the divisive as well on the social side. And I think everybody is aware of the growing inequality we've seen around the world. Oxfam just released a report 2 days ago talking about how the 10 richest men in the world, and the 10 richest people are men, but more than doubled their wealth during the pandemic. And there's been a huge amount of concentration of wealth, power, value in the hands of a few. And And an example of being alternative to that is definitely possible. Those examples are coming from across different sectors that are deliberately distributed in the way that they're sharing opportunity and value. And that goes into the practices that supersede these organizations. A couple of examples that I'll give is ones that I know quite intimately from the fair trade world when I was at the World Fair Trade Organization, where huge amounts of examples that come to mind where businesses have deliberately gone to more difficult to reach marginalized communities to create opportunities for them, whether it's Manos del Uruguay in Uruguay, which is co-owned by 12 different producer cooperatives across Uruguay, or it's an example such as Mahaguti in Nepal, which is deliberately working with communities that many would consider higher risk and higher cost, who are beyond areas that are hard to reach because of the Maoist conflict going on there, which also is an organization that reinvests all of its profits back in its social mission. To examples like Creative Handicrafts in Mumbai, which is a worker-owned model of fashion production, but has also got a policy of bringing in workers who have very few other options in life. So these are businesses that aren't choosing the easy route, they're deliberately choosing the harder route, and that there's something in their enterprise model that is pushing in that direction. The stakeholder governance models that we've seen as well, like El Puente in Germany, quite a significant player in the fair trade world, which is co-owned and co-governed by producers, as well as its own workers, as well as the network of community shops across Germany. And then we've got the Houdini model, and thinking about some of the way it has open product design and the way that it doesn't hold on to its intellectual property and allows people to use it because it realizes that it needs to be replicated. These models of production, these designs of products need to be copied by others if we're going to get to a point of having greater impact on our planet. And obviously companies that are going above and beyond on paying greater taxes and being deliberate about not minimizing tax, but paying its fair share. And there's no shortage of those examples, especially from the SME world, but very few among the world's larger companies. Now, a lot of these questions come up because for us, it's about explaining what is it about this enterprise that has allowed it to take these steps? What is it in its design, in its core, in its DNA that's allowed it to be taking steps that are bucking the norms, whether it's undertaking modular design or working with producers and workers and artisans who are much more difficult to work with, or working in areas and products where perhaps the returns aren't as high, but actually they're going to have a greater impact on the world. So why is it that they're able to do it and others can't? Now, there are many answers to this question, but one of the answers that transcends a lot of these examples is the question of enterprise design. And we look at enterprise design through a lens that is borrowed and slightly adapted from the great thinker Marjorie Kelly, who wrote Owning Our Future, and my colleague and co-founder of our Doughnut Economics Action Lab, Kate Rayworth, has added to this. And it's about thinking through the concepts of purpose, network, governance, ownership of finance. Now, this is a way that allows us to prompt ourselves to think about structural aspects of the business. How is it structured? It's not a model that is for certification. It's not a model that is for standard setting, but it's a way of actually creating innovation in this area to unlock possibilities. And it's about going from the old extractive model of the 20th century enterprise, which asked the question, how much financial value can we extract from this enterprise, to going to the 21st century enterprise that we desperately need to populate our economies with, which is about asking how many benefits can we generate in the way we design this enterprise. So let's get into this. What do we mean by enterprise design? What do we mean by these design traits of purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance? Well, one example of purpose is Dong Energy in Denmark, which has gone from being a fossil fuels company to deliberately doing a 180 and becoming a renewable energy company. This change in the core product of the business, the core service of the business, is one really strong way of demonstrating purpose. Now, purpose can also be demonstrated and partly covered by really interesting and important certifications like social enterprise or fair trade enterprise or B Corp, but it can also be covered by legal forms such as an L3C or a community interest company. Now, all of these have aspects of asking what is the purpose of the business? Why does it exist? purpose alone and articulating a clear purpose alone is insufficient. We also need to look at the networks that the business finds itself in. So these are the trading networks, these are its partnerships, these are the way it engages with others in the sector and across the board that lock it into broader purpose that it has defined. So moving away from those commodity markets, for instance, where things are at an arm's distance, there are no commitments to each other, to much more long-term partnerships that we see in examples in businesses like Dr. Bronner's, or in aspects of the Body Shop, or in fair trade supply chains. And it's also about leaving those regressive alliances where organizations together are arguing for stopping change, to ones that are arguing for the change that we need to have in regulation and in sectoral norms, renewable energy alliances, fair tax alliances. So the company you keep, the networks you build, and the commercial networks critically are central here. But now let's go to the next level. And now we're getting quite structural. We're getting quite into the nuts and bolts of how a business is set up. And we start asking questions around the board and the principles and practices that emerge from the board, the metrics and incentives that shape the decisions of managers, and the culture and norms that shape the way priorities are set across a business. Now, all of this is about moving away from the old 20th century extractive models of enterprise, which structure all of this in service of financial benefit for shareholders and owners, to ones that, and examples obviously from many publicly listed companies, to ones that are deliberately shaping these governance mechanisms in service of social and ecological benefits for stakeholders. Now, one interesting example I came across just yesterday actually is a hydrogen car company called River Simple, which has created custodians in its board. So multiple different custodians are represented, and that includes the planet and the local ecology, as well as custodians that are representing the local community, custodians that are representing workers and other stakeholders in the business. So this multi-stakeholder model of having a custodian makeup of the board alongside other things can be really important ways of having a different governance model. If you remember the El Puente model I said earlier, for instance, they've got another multi-stakeholder model where they actually have representatives of their supply chain and their own communities and their own workers on their boards as equal partners with each other. And that creates a model where all those big, tough trade-off questions are happening inside the board. So things can be more difficult because you've got different competing interests and perspectives there. But it also means that those things that otherwise a business would externalize, they're internalizing it and able to grapple with it more directly themselves. So governance. Relatedly, very interestingly, ownership comes up next. And who is the business owned by? Now we're really at one of the hearts of the matter. Is it, and how is it owned by those different organizations, from private equity and shareholder listed companies to venture capital, to all on the right-hand side, a few things that we're starting to see on our radar of obviously employee ownership and cooperatives, but different forms of impact investing. When I did a deep dive into what allowed Fairphone to do the things it did, to buck the industry trend and buck the industry norm and have a modular phone that was seen as a little bit of a crazy idea at the time by many in the industry. Well, what allowed them was the kind of investment it brought in. It brought in initially crowdfunding that allowed it to invest into the production of its first batch of phones. And then it brought in impact investing that was deliberate about keeping a long-term perspective that hasn't actually paid itself any dividend yet. It's there to make sure that this is going to work and have a sustainable future for the business itself. Employee ownership has been in the news a lot around the world, and we're seeing a huge amount of conversions happening in a lot of countries. Here's one example I gave. Another one would be Richer Sounds, which is a big retail chain that's just converted into employee ownership. But across the US and the world, we're seeing employee ownership as a model that's beginning to take off. Another model of ownership that's worth really underlining here is steward ownership, because here you can create different classes of shares that have different rights to dividends, but also have different ability to steward the company when times get tough. So for instance, some of the companies that you can see listed here have got purpose shares or steward shares or golden shares, where a foundation owns that share, that they don't collect a dividend, but they have a veto right. When the business starts to deviate from its core mission or its purpose, it can step in and stop that from happening. Now, none of these companies are perfect. All of them have got shortcomings. However, it is an interesting model to think about, that we can actually structure ownership differently. We can be deliberate about who has different kinds of financial rights and who has different kinds of potentially rights to stop any deviation from the veto rights, basically, any deviation from its core purpose. So we've gone through purpose, networks, governance, ownership. Now the last one, and again, there are huge overlaps here between these categories, but it's worth considering them separately, is finance. Now finance is about how the conditions on which finance comes in, the kind of power they have, and the relationship they have with the business. And it's about the role of finance in the old extractive enterprise of being quarter is king, growing sales, growing profits, growing market share, to finance really serving that purpose of expanding benefits, reinvesting for impacts, driving long-term. Here we see things like dividend caps or ways to limit the upside of an exit, which allows breathing space for a business to reinvest in things that maybe otherwise it would not have reinvested in. So you've got huge amounts of options here. And I think the point of looking at it this way is not to say there is a model that already exists. It's B Corp, it's social enterprise, it's employee ownership. It's about thinking about all of this as ways of us innovating new models of enterprise that could happen. You know, there are fantastic examples already, models out there already, but I think it's an area that is ripe for innovation, that we could start really supercharging the kind of models we start seeing around the world. Now, one example I want to just quickly give is Unilever, and I'm going to follow this up with another one called Danone, because there's a really interesting tale here about how their enterprise design allowed it to go so far, but not further. Now, Unilever, many of you will know, was one of the leaders and remains one of the leaders in the food and beverage industry and the consumer goods industry more broadly. It's had some of the world leading plans. It's joined leading networks of businesses to push for progressive change. It was a really important voice on putting climate change higher on the ladder, for instance. It's set really important and ambitious commitments on water use, on CO2 emissions. And interestingly and importantly, its former chief executive, and that's important to remember, former Paul Polman, came out and said, we'll stop quarterly reporting and we can't be slaves to shareholders. Now, this was quite radical at the time, and he was pushing through quite a strong agenda at Unilever. What happened was Kraft Heinz and 3G Capital came in, related to Warren Buffett and others, came in to say, well, actually, we see value here. We see a company that is investing longer term in a way that maybe is not maximizing profits for us. We see some of these sustainability commitments creating costs, and we're not sure it's creating the returns that they are promising. And we think we can buy this company out, strip it of its sustainability commitments, and then resell it at a higher price by improving its immediate commercial performance. It became prey for the way that it was undertaking some of its sustainability policies, many of which were also had shortcomings, by the way, but it was going beyond the pale with many of its competitors. Unilever mounted a defense. It was able to stop the takeover, but in doing so, it had to change its practices. It had to shed some of its own commitments on some of these issues that it had taken a leadership position on. And there was something in the design of the enterprise that made it vulnerable to that sort of external takeover. There's also not any shortage of companies that would say that, look, when the founder has lost control of the business to external financiers, then the mission drifts began. And whether it's venture capital or it's other forms of bringing investors into the company, those tales are important because people start seeing that there's a very different culture in the business. Danone, very similar story, very similar commitments, very similar links and networks with other businesses and others to try to push for more progressive change across the business world. Even certified some of its subsidiaries as B Corps, made huge commitments to reporting, became more transparent, and capital markets bit back. They said, look, this is pushing the envelope too far. We think this might be costing us money and taking away from some of the returns that we'd like to have. Their incredibly charismatic and visionary CEO and chairman, Emmanuel Faber, was ousted, and the financial markets were able to rein it back in. So huge amounts of leadership still continuing with both of those companies. But what it shows is that actually there's something in the design of companies, and a lot of it, when it's publicly listed, becomes an aspect and a trait that transcends this framework. Its networks, its purpose, its governance, its ownership of finance, all of it can become limited by the fact that it has a particular kind of finance behind it that can rein it in on particular decisions. So it forces us to ask ourselves, as people involved in businesses that are not global multinational enterprises, but are of different scale and different scope, still the same question of which design traits draw back these businesses into being extractive, and which design traits already enable our business to become generative, just like in a forest where we see different trees living in unison in a way where different plants and fauna were able to share nutrients, are able to support each other, not necessarily try to outgrow to a point where they take over everything. That generous nature in which you have a balanced ecosystem, what would that look like in terms of enterprise design? As a sort of a final point on this, one other way of thinking about enterprise design is to just list out all of those huge amount of actions we need to reverse that picture on the top right, to reverse that direction of travel we're in, where we are both destroying our planet and we are on path to not giving ourselves as societies life's essentials. Well, we need a huge amount of action to overcome this. There's no limit to the things that are needed. Some of these need to be done by the state, by the commons, by civil society, by charities. Some of them need to be done by businesses around the world. Now, if we look at business through the lens of maximizing profits, the kind of actions that can be justified by maximum profits is a very small amount. It doesn't justify all of the actions that are needed. As the Doughnut and Unilever example showed us, a bunch of them were deemed to be, no, you're not maximizing profits by doing this. We're pulling you back from that brink. And we end up having a very small level of possibilities of solutions from business. However, if we expand the art of the possible by redesigning business, by demonstrating that something is viable and it's actually desirable in terms of societal and ecological benefit, but we need a broader perspective, and that perspective needs to be baked into the decision-making structures of business, then we start broadening the range of possibilities of the kinds of solutions we can drive. So that's my main spiel on Doughnut Economics and business. I also wanted to invite you guys to join the Doughnut Economics community. It's an online platform community. It's free to join. People are engaging around the world and leading change in lots of different cities and countries and neighborhoods and towns and villages to take Doughnut Economics into practice. A lot of this is happening in terms of policy level, but also in terms of individual and community level. We're not allowing businesses to join as businesses, but individuals are joining in their own individual capacity. And that sort of has grown around the world, and we've had a huge amount of activities that are beginning to transpire around the world. So we invite you to join doughuteconomics.org if you're interested in any of this, and I'm very keen to hear what you guys think about what I've presented and whether any of it makes sense, and I'd love to hear any challenges from anyone as well. So maybe if you could type your questions in or raise your hand, that would be wonderful. I'm going to stop recording here as well so that we have a nice safe space for discussion for the questions.